The KTM 950 Adventure is one of the most revered, well-loved, cult adventure bikes of the last 30 years. People that love that bike love it hard, and that made it the perfect bike for episode 2 of Retro vs Modern. When it comes to talking about the 950, that bike is without doubt a cult adventure bike. It has a really strong following from a die-hard group of fans online that shout louder than everyone else about how great their bike is. Whenever we post anything about a new adventure bike, there's always someone in the comments that wants to remind us how great they think their 950 is or how great they think their 990 is. And from the moment I took it off-road and started riding it with a little bit of poise and purpose, I understand why. I think that bike, when you ride it now in today's climate, really stands out as being a bit ahead of its time. It's really good off-road. It's got this character that is purposeful and comfortable and quite balanced, and it feels like KTM built a really serious adventure bike when they designed this bike. For me, that whole package starts with the engine. I really like the engine. The LC8 motor has been in a lot of bikes over the years. It's kind of gone through a lot of iterations and got better and better and made more and more power. But the 950 engine in its own right feels really good. I think there's an immediacy to the torque, so it feels really instant. It surges forward, it wants to go, but it's not in an overly aggressive way. It's kind of nicely balanced. It's got that carbureted smoothness and pleasantness to it, while still also packing punch. It still goes quick, it still pulls hard, and generally is a really good engine. The chassis is also along the same lines. It has a lot of poise, it feels really quite responsive and generally really nice to ride off-road. Immediately when I jumped on it and rode, I felt quite comfortable. I didn't feel like I had to learn to understand it. It didn't do anything particularly weird. And the same applies to the suspension. The suspension was consistent. It held up in the stroke pretty well. It wasn't wallowy, it wasn't a mess. It was doing everything quite well up until a point. And that's what was really interesting about the 950 for me, is that this bike was really good off-road until it wasn't. And then it bit you, and it always felt underneath everything, the more you pushed and the more you rode, that there was an edge to it, that there was a little grenade under the wheels that at any moment it was going to explode and it was going to let you know that it's a really big bike. It really shone through in certain areas, and the first one of those is when you start to push the speed a little bit. When you push on and the terrain gets a bit bumpy, the 950 feels great, and then you'll hit something a bit harder and it blows through the stroke on the fork in much the same way as adventure bikes have for a long time. It doesn't have the bottoming resistance that gives it that safety net that lets you feel like if you make a mistake, you're going to be okay. And the same kind of feels like is happening with the chassis and the weight balance. It pushes a lot, it gets a little bit wild. It's generally quite quick to remind you that you need to respect it, and it is a big bike. The KTM 790 is a different story. Overall, the 790 has this incredibly nice feeling when you ride them back to back, that it's the same bike 15 years further down the line. It really feels like a progression, and that's a massive contrast to the first episode of Retro vs Modern that we did, where the Africa Twin models felt like Honda had gone in very different directions with what they wanted their bike to be. To me, it feels like KTM still have an understanding and a long-term goal of what their bike should be about. And the 790 feels like a 950, but it just does everything a bit better and a bit safer when it comes to riding off-road. I think there's two standout things, and one is the safety net that the 790 has around it is much broader and much bigger. You can go a lot quicker, a lot safer, and it controls everything better. The chassis has better feedback through the wheels. It feels like you're getting much better grip from the front end. The suspension has more poise, and when you catch something you didn't expect or you hit a big hole, it soaks it up much better. The mid-stroke is much quicker to stop. You don't get that bottoming out. And generally the chassis is sharper and the bike feels dramatically lighter. And it feels lighter because it is. While 17 or so kilos doesn't sound like a huge amount, in riding practice, it feels enormous. Where the KTM 950 pushes, the 790 holds. It gives you a world of confidence that you didn't know you needed, and overall it makes for a much easier bike to ride. That carries over into the manageability of the bike. The 950 is, unfortunately for 950 KTM owners, a big bike. It feels tall. It feels quite top heavy, and when you're in technical environments, you're turning the bike around a lot, or you're trying to manage the weight and do tight turns, that starts to unravel itself, and it really quickly erodes your confidence. On the 950, I regularly felt like I was having to manage the bike, and it didn't encourage me to push the limits. I didn't want to take risks on it because I was worried I was going to lose the balance and fall over a lot. I really had to concentrate and put a lot of effort into keeping that bike upright that I really didn't have to on the 790. The window really spread when the environment got more and more technical, and that chassis and that lightness and that balance that the 790 has, that it's been so lauded for, really starts to shine through. Interestingly, the engine department is slightly different. Now, things have moved a long way since the 950 came out. That bike's carburetted, which means it's a cable throttle with a carb slide. It's a very manual, physical feeling thing, and it creates a really nice tangible feeling in your hand when you use it. It's very instant, there's a weight to it that's very comforting, and I think that to this day, electronic throttles haven't quite replicated that as well. Now, one of the few complaints that I've had and a few other people have had about the 790 is that it is a little bit woolly, a little bit vague, and the throttle to what the engine is doing doesn't quite match up. They've kind of mapped around the use of the throttle to make the bike do what they want it to do. Interestingly, when you ride the bikes back to back on the same ground, up the same tricky hills, the 790 is marginally easier to ride. It's marginally easier to stop the back wheel spinning, to get some grip, to crawl it up things. And that's interesting because neither of these bikes are particularly good at that. Stepping out onto the tarmac, the 950 kind of surprised me a little bit. Having got a good feeling for it off-road, I was expecting a similar sort of feeling on the road, and that is what I got. Generally, I think the performance of it's pretty good, and I can see, having ridden it on the road, why maybe road journalists back in the day didn't understand this bike that well. There's definitely a kind of feeling that it goes well, but not great on the road. And generally, it has an overwhelming feeling of feeling like a bike with a 21-inch front wheel. There's a characteristic in the past that bikes with 21-inch front wheels have had, and it's a mild nervousness. They kind of drop into corners a little bit quickly. They don't have a nice planted feel like a lot of smaller wheel bikes have, where they have a wider front tire. And that maybe made it feel a bit nervous. You were never quite comfortable with the weight balance of it and that 21-inch front wheel to really lean it over and let it roll around the corners. I never gained a lot of confidence. On the flip side, I think the engine's really nice. I really like that low down torque curve. I like the way it pulls. You can kind of pull a bit of a taller gear, roll out of corners, and generally that's a really nice characteristic. It is a little bit vibey on the road. I did notice that more so than I did off-road. And I think that kind of got better in the later models as KTM refined the engine and the bike as a whole. With the 950, it didn't blow me away and it didn't kind of disappoint me. It sat in a middle ground where it was okay. And that's mostly because the new 790 is so good on the road. Now, without kind of proverbially blowing smoke up KTM's backside, that 790 for me is as good on road as it is off road. It has fantastic handling traits that make it a really, really enjoyable bike to ride. It's very effortless on the road, but in a really poised way, where the 950 drops in quickly and kind of feels a little bit nervous. The 790 rolls into the corner really smoothly. It has incredible feedback from the ground. You feel like there's endless amounts of grip, even on off-road tires. I feel like I can just roll through corners at whatever speed I come into it. I don't have to put any effort in, and it's incredibly confidence inspiring. The engine is a little bit different. It's an engine that likes to be a bit higher in the revs. It's a little bit more modern, a little bit more sport bike on the road, I would say. you generally, I think, ride it more in the meat of the power than you have to on the 950. And actually the 950 with its carburetor and its lovely woolly kind of warmth to it and its really strong torque is nice. On the top end, I think they feel pretty even, but I think you don't spend as much time there on the 950 because you don't have to. As an overall street bike, that 790 feels like a huge progression. Even though they've got the same size wheels and the same tires on them, it feels like the 790 took a step into a category that I think honestly was set by Honda's Africa Twin when it first came out, of that 21-inch front wheel, not feeling nervous. KTM have definitely managed to achieve that in this bike. The front wheel doesn't feel nervous at all. It feels very planted. And it's a very modern progression from what bikes were 15 years ago. I think if you push the miles on these bikes, then you start to notice that there is a little bit of a split. The 950 Adventure feels very much like a bike that was designed to do everything. It's got lots of wind protection, it's got a nice big screen on it, and that works really, really well when you have to crunch miles, when it's cold out. Our test has been super cold, and the 790 wasn't quite the same. It wasn't as good on the wind protection front. It's a little bit less nice if you had to ride a long way, but generally they feel very similar, with everything kind of being a little bit better, a little bit more poised, a little bit more fun, and a little bit more effortless on the new one. Overall, one of the most interesting things about this test for me is that it feels like KTM have consistently improved things, and when they went back to the drawing board with this bike, they really hit all the same marks they were trying to hit then. They've just done a better job. I think the 950 all round is a really good bike. There's lots of little touches on it that I think KTM have kept doing, and they're what make KTM a really thoughtful brand, from things like the chain carrier to little details on the 950, like the rally style trip. That's all really cool. And one of the things that really stood out on the 950 for me in terms of a rider experience was the controls. The controls on this 15-year-old bike still feel great. The clutch is awesome. It's really light, it's really purposeful. The brakes still have a lovely feel to them even though they're 15 years old. And that's something that other brands aren't doing now. The brakes still don't feel good now in 2019. And that stuff has carried over to the 790. There's a few little changes that have happened on the KTMs. A few years ago, they moved away from using the kind of little dirt bike style levers to more big road bike levers. But actually they still feel really good. The clutch has still got a nice action to it. The throttle is light and purposeful. The brakes feel really, really good. And generally that package of the 790 is very similar to the 950. Firstly, thanks very much for watching this far. If you like this video, hit that subscribe button, throw a like down, or chuck a comment down below. They really help us. The more views we get, the easier it is for us to keep making these videos. And lastly, I'd love to say a big thanks to our sponsors. They're the people that are helping us to keep making these videos. So if you could check out their products in the description, or our Patreon page where we have some amazing subscribers helping us to keep making videos, or you fancy buying a t-shirt, those links are all down below. And otherwise, thanks for watching, and remember, life's better when you're riding.